there from the District 7? Okay, thank you. We were out now recording. Welcome. And I believe everybody is attending through the room. We've got three members, citizens attending in the attendance box. So welcome. This is our District 7 webinar. We try to do this monthly on a hot topic within the community. These webinars are to be a dialogue with me and a guest. And today our guest is Cole DeLaune from the District 4 office in Lawton. And we're going to be discussing the hearings that were held the last week of October, kind of what led into that for our beginning discussion with him, how the hearings went after that, and then what our plan is moving forward for what are we going to do with the information that was shared with us during those hearings. But first, I'd like to have Cole introduce himself a little bit. Many of our District 7 citizens may not be familiar who he is, what families he comes from. But I'd like to start off just having an introduction of Legislator Cole DeLaune. So, Cole, how are you doing this afternoon? And just jump right in.
Well, I'm doing this peachily. Long time no see, Warren. I just ran into you yesterday at the distribution event for Oklahoma City. Always good to run into you in real life since I feel like we often see each other remotely and virtually via Zoom more often than not. For the benefit of Cindy, Clark, and Dina, I hope I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. My name is Cole Kickingbird DeLaune. I am the legislator for District 4. I'm, I guess, the most novice of the legislators. I've been in office since October of 2024, so just over a year now. I succeeded Elena Quitone, who resigned for, I believe, kind of personal reasons in August of 2024. And my district office is Lawton proper. The majority of that, everything from Lee Boulevard up to the mountains. It actually kind of progresses past the mountains, years, all of those historical families to include kind of the Caddo County line. So in terms of volume, I believe I'm generally commensurate with districts 1 and districts 2 in terms of population. And of course, your population, Warren, dwarfs all of those, but we have about 900 constituents each, give or take, in the kind of count for 1, 2, and 4. And happy to be here with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Cole. I appreciate you joining. Some ground rules for this webinar. Everyone that attends has the opportunity to submit questions and answer we're going to be visiting here for about 30 minutes. Then we'll go to a Q&A session. And at the bottom of your screen, if you move your cursor to the bottom part, you should see a Q&A box pop up. That's where you can write your question, whatever question you may have. And we're going to get to those questions at the end. Some ground rules. Please center your questions on the topic of discussion for this webinar. We don't want to distract and get off topic. So we're primarily focusing our discussion on the hearings, what led to those hearings, how the hearings went, and then what the legislature intends to do with that information moving on out of the hearings that we had with the executive branch. So just some ground rules for that. And Cole, so let's jump right in. We had these hearings have been, I guess we've been rolling up to it probably since a little after you joined the legislature. Kind of give us a little bit of an idea of what led into these hearings, if you would, in your
Yes,
own opinion.
of course. Well, I think we sort of have a balance to achieve over the course of the next 60 minutes, but we've got a full hour. So I think that'll be more than enough time to kind of go through a snapshot of kind of the historical background and then also kind of the perspective plan of where we go from here. But as you mentioned, first thing being first, that kind of background and the variables that operated as a genesis for the hearings themselves may be helpful for our attendees to kind of get a grasp on. And I've dived into some of these over the course of the past summer and the beginning of fall, with my District 4 constituents at community meetings. So hopefully I'm not being kind of duplicative, but just stop me if I dive too far into the weeds. But I think kind of to provide everyone with the sort of structural big picture overview that's probably salient to this discussion. As you are aware, Warren, we're about to kind of commence on budgetary construction for the next fiscal year of 2026 through 2027 coming up here in December. Customarily, the process of building out the sort of budget annually begins in that kind of Christmas time period. And constitutionally, the chairman is mandated to submit his draft of an annual budget to the legislature by February 1st. He did not meet that deadline this past year. And in December of 2024, a couple of months after I came on board, as you mentioned, we sort of undertook the kind of customary beginnings of outreach to the executive branch to try to get a grasp on all of the variables and factors that have sort of played into the fiscal state and the fiscal landscape of the tribe in the kind of interests of building out that budget for this current fiscal year that we're in the midst of, which is fiscal year 25 through 26. And as kind of I noted just a minute ago, the chairman, of course, did not make that mandated February 1st deadline that's required by the Constitution. And we also began to run into what I would characterize as a reluctance to share information pertinent to the overall picture of our tribe finances. And I'll give three concrete examples of that. But before I do, just again to build out the sort of background and context, I think it's important to note that over the course of the past number of years, the tribe has been relatively flush with federal ARPA dollars amid the coronavirus pandemic and its aftermath. And as you are aware, Warren, and as of course the rest of the legislature is aware, those ARPA funds have allowed the tribe to do things like double the amount of the elder check distribution payment every holiday season, from about $500 to $1,000 in the current amount that's distributed this year. And those ARPA funds have also underwritten in part or kind of in whole a variety of important programmatic aid, burial assistance, and some of the kind of elements that are encompassed under the umbrella of burial assistance would be one example of that. And those monies for ARPA had to be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and they have to be expended by the end of calendar year 2026, which is just 13 months away. And you and the rest of the legislature and I will be sort of tackling kind of stewardship and build out of a budget in coordination with the executive branch over the course of the spring that will witness the kind of final disbursements of those ARPA monies. But I kind of provide that context just to note that the fiscal state of the tribe will look very different once those ARPA funds have been expended and they are kind of spent and gone. Because again, as I mentioned, they've underwritten a variety of endeavors. So there will be a shuffleboard of sorts where we're going to have to, as a tribe government, determine where we can pull money from to sort of replace the ARPA funds that have underwritten so many of those kind of programmatic and also direct assistance endeavors. And as I mentioned before, I kind of wanted to provide three concrete examples of the sort of challenges with clarity of communication and what I would sort of personally, subjectively characterize as the sort of reticence and non-responsiveness of the executive branch over the course of kind of the period from December 2024 to July of 2025, when we have undertaken efforts to ask questions about tribe monies and sort of how they've been allocated, just so that we can get a comprehensive understanding of the full scope of what our tribe fiscal state looks like. As you kind of are aware, Warren, one of the kind of questions that arose that's pretty just sort of obvious is anyone who listens to the chairman's weekly radio address and Facebook updates knows that he often references Kiowa Inc. And when we took a look in kind of spring of this year at the chairman's proposed budget draft, we noticed as a legislature that there was no line itemization for Kiowa Inc. So given kind of how frequently he references the endeavors that are set to sort of, or prospectively slated to take place under its umbrella, a really organic, reasonable question, I think, is, okay, where is this money going to come from? Because it's not line itemized in the annual budget that we see at this juncture. And as we sort of floated that question, again, very simple question and query to the executive branch, we sort of got conflicting information. On April 4th, we finally got some sort of response from the chairman about that particular question. He stated that ARPA monies of an indeterminate amount have been used to subsidize the undertakings of Kiowa Inc. to date, and that's where they would be pulled from. And then as sort of discussions and interactions unfolded over the spring, with the executive branch, by late May, that story had shifted diametrically when our chief financial officer and treasurer, William Weaver, stated that no bank accounts presently existed at that time containing funding for Kiowa Inc. And so we requested just confirmation as a legislature in writing of that sort of perspective from Mr. Weaver. And he sort of just said, well, you need to talk to the chairman about that because he is kind of obviously the leader of the executive branch, and that's who your question needs to be directed to. And we undertook sort of further discussion with the finance during that kind of week in late May. And the sort of information again evolved to a different picture where $200,000 from local and tribal consistency funds had already been dispersed to Kiowa Farm and Ranch, I believe. And the prospective plan for this fiscal year, or what the executive branch wanted to do for this fiscal year, was allocate $1.5 million in the local and tribal consistency fund monies to stand up Kiowa Inc. over the course of 2025 to 2026. And we asked for line itemization about how that money would actually be applied under the umbrella of Kiowa Inc. for fiscal year 25 to 26. And to date, we have never received that line itemization from the executive branch. And again, we'll probably maybe potentially dive into this later, but just for context, local and tribal consistency funds are a pool of money distributed by the federal government that are kind of interrelated to ARPA monies, and how the executive branch has approached that to date prior to this fiscal year has been just noting it as one big line item in the annual budget. And what that effectively has created is a sort of $3.7 million is what the tribe received initially as the allocation from the feds for LATCF funds. But what that has sort of initially done structurally is create a de facto slush fund where they can apply the money to sort of any application within the federal guidelines that are permitted for LATCF funds to be used. And that presents both kind of the flexibility that has been helpful in this past kind of couple of months, because as a legislature, we were able to appropriate money from that big pool of funding to stand up the Emergency Response Fund aid in $300 disbursements that we just passed back in Halloween in anticipation of kind of SNAP suspensions. But the kind of flip side of that coin is whenever there's not any sort of line itemized deconstruction in the budget, it obviously creates a situation where there's not necessarily a ton of clarity about how those monies are being utilized by the executive branch in practice. And Warren, I know that you passed the and sponsored the Budget Transparency Act back in the end of calendar year 2023, and that was a great measure. But I think we've also seen where there have been not necessarily the kind of most faithful compliance on the part of the executive branch to the kind of mandate in that law to publish line itemized budgets. And to kind of proceed on to a different example, in April of 2025, the legislature learned through social media, not from the executive branch, that a federal investigation had been initiated in January of 2024 and been ongoing for a year and a half by the Office of Inspector Department of the Treasury. So that's a federal agency, and they had enlisted a Virginia-based accounting firm called Castro and Company to perform a desk review of tribe spending of coronavirus relief fund dollars. And as anyone kind of may or may not be aware, coronavirus relief fund monies were the sort of pot of federal aid that was authorized by Congress prior to ARPA. And obviously, the legislature was kind of startled to learn that the OIG, Office of Inspector General, Department of the Treasury, had been reviewing our kind of use as a tribe of those coronavirus relief fund monies for over a year and a half, effectively. And the legislature had kind of just been kept in the dark by the executive branch. When we asked why that had not been communicated to us, I think we kind of got the response that, from the executive branch, that they just didn't know we would want to even be aware of something of that nature. That, of course, was personally shocking to me, and I think also surprised a lot of the other legislators. But the Castro and Company review was completed in December of 2024, and it identified about $8.5 million in question costs where there was not adequate documentation or the expenditure of money had been non-compliant with federal guidelines for coronavirus relief fund monies. And the sort of troubling part there is that the methodology that the accounting firm Castro and Company used to sort of ascertain or identify question costs was randomized, which means that we can't extrapolate how much money or project out exactly how much money in millions of dollars there would be in question costs if the Department of Treasury, OIG, were to say, just review every single expenditure made by the tribe under those federal dollars. And then to also kind of put this in context, prior to this year and amendments initiated by the legislature to amend the KCOA charter, the casino had been sending about $9 million over every fiscal year for tribe operations as sort of movement of funds. And then they had been retaining the bulk of kind of their net revenue each fiscal year to manage themselves. But if you think about it, $8.5 million in question cost, if we have to pay that back to the feds at any juncture, that would effectively eat up a full year's allocation to date, according to the standard operating procedure of what the casino had been sending over. Obviously, that would have a huge impact upon the fiscal state of the tribe. And that's just an example of kind of the sort of way the movements by the executive branch had kept the legislature in the dark. And then kind of finally, just as another concrete example, and there are more than just these three, but I want to be relatively concise since we're already at 12:18 and not dive too much into long-windedness. But Kiowas are probably aware by now, generally speaking, that a separate federal investigation has been going on since 2023, and that's encompassed the current chairman of the Kiowa Casino Operations Authority Board of Directors, and also 4 former trustees of the KCOA board. And in January of 2025, Chairman McMahon published commentary to Facebook that falsely stated that that NIGC investigation had concluded and found all KCOA members under its inquiry, quote unquote, innocent of all wrongdoing. That at the time was news to the legislature. So we kind of sent over a really simple question in the spring, which was, could you please update us with documentation on the developments that led you to make the assertion that the investigation had concluded? And of course, that's pretty straightforward. It's a relatively reasonable question to ask. And what kind of ensued was a bizarre back and forth with Mr. McMahon stating that he couldn't respond to questions about his own words that he had publicly shared. And then Chairman Spotted intervening actually via correspondence to the legislature, asserting that he was directing the KCOA and Kiowa Gaming Commission to refrain from answering any questions from the legislature about these topics. So that's just sort of 3 kind of snapshots of the pattern that's evolved over the course of spring of 2025, where we were not getting information. We were kind of running into these bizarre assertions by the chairman where he stated, people under the executive branch umbrella are not obliged to respond to your queries, and I'm directing them not to engage with you. That sort of led us to kind of the process that we're here to talk about today. And, fundamentally, simple and reasonable questions about tribe finances were going unanswered. And the legislature just decided to formalize our questions through legislative hearings, which is a process that the legislature is empowered to undertake by tribe law and also consistent with some of the mandates of the Constitution. One of the salient kind of components here is that the Constitution requires the legislature to quote unquote monitor the actions of the government. And, folks who are familiar with state legislatures or Congress in DC, or who even just watch kind of casually C-SPAN or CNN, are probably aware to some degree that inquiry hearings are pretty routine in those bodies. In DC, they happen all the time. They happen with subcommittees in Congress, as well as kind of full congressional chambers. And so during his own testimony at the legislative hearings, which took place in October, Chairman Spotted Bird declared that the legislature is setting a quote unquote dangerous precedent. And I don't know if he's unfamiliar with congressional practice or kind of state legislative practice, but the precedents in those bodies and in other tribal legislatures, like the Navajo Nation legislature, which is currently kind of undertaking its own inquiry hearing process, is that this kind of like fact-finding endeavor by a legislative body is pretty standard operating procedure. And my understanding as well is that the chairman in kind of recent weeks has characterized the legislature as fighting with him. But none of these proceedings, at least from my perspective, and I know from your perspective, Warren, and I don't want to speak for any of the other legislators, but I would think that they would share this kind of point of view, is that none of these proceedings have really constituted some sort of adversarial brawl. We're just trying to ascertain facts about the fiscal welfare of the tribe, consistent with our constitutional responsibility to monitor the actions of the government. And, I don't think it's a secret based upon some of his Facebook addresses that the chairman has expressed hostility to these undertakings. But fundamentally, all of this is about one very simple question, which is, does the chairman, as an elected leader of the tribe, have an obligation to answer questions about tribe money and how it's being spent? And my perspective on that is yes, he does have an obligation to answer those questions. And, the legislature, as you're well aware, as some of our attendees may be interested to learn, we voted unanimously to kind of initiate these hearings to determine and outline kind of a fair procedural foundation for the rules and regulations of the proceedings. And unanimously, the kind of collective perspective among the legislature is that, yes, it is not unreasonable for elected officials of the tribe to be obligated to answer questions about tribe money. And so that brings us to where we are today. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about what the future looks like, but that was a little long-winded. I err on the side of long-windedness for the sake of giving people full comprehensive information and background data, but hopefully that gives a full sketch of kind of what led to where we are in the present.
Thank you, Cole, for doing that. I think you gave a pretty good, concise as it can be, because I share your concern that, part of our responsibility is to approve an annual budget. The chairman drafts that budget, and we had a lot of questions about some of the expenditures get put in line items. And then, like you said, when it came to Kiowa Inc., there were missing line items. Like you're starting a business. When we asked for more information, what business is this going to be? We asked for business plans, right, Cole? We asked for what is the strategic plan for this business? It's going to get startup money. Where does that startup money come from? Because it obviously is not in the budget right here. So we want to know what's the plan. You're going to start a business, for example, teepee making. I heard that the tribe was going to enter into a teepee making business, and there was no money in that budget. And then he said, well, that's a
Right.
business under Kiowa Inc. Okay, well, then why aren't you sharing how you're going to fund Kiowa Inc. and start up
Yeah,
all these businesses? And
absolutely.
that was a problem, because we can't do our job when we don't have all the information from the tribe. And another major stop in the budget, or concern on the last year's budget, was um, he wanted to give raises, right? He specific raises to I think some of them were 15 to 17% raises. It was just inconsistent. A lot of those were for major high level positions such as the CFO, the Attorney General himself. There was also people in within the finance department, and we as a legislature questioned those raises.
Right.
Why are you giving these people this type of raise? And his response was, "Well, well, I got to pay people what they're worth." And be consistent with what people are being paid. Let's take the Attorney General, for example. He said, I got to pay the Attorney General what he's worth. Well, the Attorney General for the Kiowa tribe right now is getting paid more than Gettner Drummond, the Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Gettner Drummond has a large staff at the state capitol, and he's doing business every day for the state. And this attorney general, to my understanding, is not a full-time employee, but a part-time employee. Is that your understanding too, Cole?
Well, yeah, I think structurally that's kind of a perfect example of some of the inconsistencies in the budgetary allocations that the chairman has made to date that we were trying to get a handle on and
Yeah,
just trying to undertake questions to get more clarity regarding. Um,
absolutely.
as you point out, and I've been very vocal about kind of my reservations related to Attorney General Homburg's $206,000 salary, which is more than twice what any Kiowa and also, as you mentioned, it's, I believe, at a rate of $70,000 more than the AG of the state of Oklahoma makes. And during the legislative inquiry hearings, we discovered, rather clarified, I guess, it wasn't necessarily news to us, that of course, AG Homburg has no direct reports under his purview at the tribe. He doesn't manage anyone. He also has, I believe he mentioned, and I'm going to stipulate that I could be inaccurate or misremembering this, but I believe he mentioned he worked on kind of four different pieces of litigation for the tribe over the course of his time with us, and he's getting paid at a rate of 70,000 more than the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, just as sort of another kind of data point that fleshes that out a little bit more. For I believe fiscal year 23, Ballotpedia has a listing of the salaries for all state attorneys general within the US. And I believe $206,000 is a higher rate of pay than 48 of those, which is when you think about kind of, the variability of populations represented. It's just wild to me that we would be paying this gentleman at such an exorbitant sum. And it's actually morally unconscionable to me because, as you mentioned, one sort of variable there is that beyond the $206,000 salary that the attorney general makes, he has a $250,000 line item, the chairman does, in his executive branch budget for legal services. And he enlists, I don't think that this is, not well known to folks, but he enlists folks, just independent legal counsel like Robert Little to round out his sort of legal team. But his kind of position when we were discussing this internally with him was that the attorney general, I believe, would somehow, I guess, make a more efficient use of tribe funds. That's not been the case when we have to pay or have another funding pool for other lawyers to come in to support him when he's already making that kind of exorbitant amount of money. And then I think the other question that is pertinent to these sort of discussions and just provides folks with a snapshot of this isn't necessarily just about kind of compliance with best practices in general of financial management. But the attorney general, the creation of that role predated, I believe, yeah, it predated my time on the legislature. But the chairman, I believe, just kind of wanted that added into the budget and never sought to have any sort of duties or job responsibilities delineated in statute or worked with the legislature to kind of delineate the responsibilities and duties of that role. And that's obviously been a problem as well. And so there's just kind of, that's just one example of how, a problematic or structural kind of component also has an attendant kind of host of other variables and factors and complications to it. And then with respect to kind of just a point you made earlier, Warren, about the best business practices. I know that, like as you mentioned, the chairman had been wanting to earmark $1.5 million out of, I believe, ARPA monies for Kiowa Inc. And I think what folks should sort of consider with that kind of paradigm is that ARPA monies can be used for endeavors, and they have been used for endeavors like burial assistance or like other aid programs. So when you devote, or when the chairman wants to devote $1.5 million of federal monies or LATCF funds that can be utilized for direct assistance or programmatic assistance, you're taking away from those structural aid programs to stand up a business endeavor. And that there's an argument to be made in the abstract that that could be a viable path forward if a business generates enough income to provide more aid in the long term than the initial disbursement of federal monies would in the short term. However, as you mentioned, the chairman never provided a business plan for effectively kind of like any of these business undertakings. That like business plans, analyses of viability are mandated by a law from 2018 called, I believe, the Economic Due Diligence Act. And so there's deviation from kind of the protocols that are mandated by tribe law and just sort of a haphazard approach. And that seems to be a consistent pattern on the chairman's part. And I think part of the one of the big kind of concerns that we dove into at the hearings was a post-mortem on Indian City screen printing. It's lost $500,000 of tribe money, just so everyone is aware and kind of gets a sense of the proportion of that. $500,000 effectively would have been more than the allocation for all emergency assistance or contingency assistance to tribe members in fiscal year 2024. And so too, what did that combination of the legal services amounts that have been budgeted in by the chairman for the attorney general and for his legal services. But kind of with respect to kind of that amount lost by Indian City screen printing, one of the kind of takeaways at the hearing that was interesting to me was we clarified with him during his testimony that he had never actually seen a finalized business plan for Indian City screen printing, and he had enlisted his former brother-in-law to helm that undertaking. And of course, we're all aware that it lost almost $500,000 in tribe monies that could have been used elsewhere, could have, stood up something like direct assistance or, programmatic assistance. And it just sort of calls into question why there has been a consistent pattern where we're not even seeing business plans to date. And that's why we had to pass a moratorium. I mean, I don't think any of us wanted to be in the position to have to pass a moratorium this past summer on the creation of new tribal corporations or businesses. But when we're not getting even business plans because they don't exist for these large investments of tribe monies and tribe dollars, obviously we can't allow that sort of mismanagement or haphazard approach to tribe resources to proceed onward. And just to sort of dive into another kind of element that's intersectional, one of the things that I thought was, really just, took me aback, was startling for me, was that when we kind of dove into the questions about Indian City screen printing, we got into an area where there was a total of $50,000 that had been dispersed from the Indian City screen printing fund to one tribe citizen named Theodore Nuncio. And we, of course, had a couple of questions for the chairman about that. And what had happened was he had effectively kind of sent a correspondence to Mr. Nuncio in June of 2023 and agreed to send over five $10,000 payments totaling a sum of $50,000 for, I guess he alternately referred to it as a loan and it as an investment in Mr. Nuncio's company. But then when we got into sort of the back and forth in the Q&A with him, he kind of conceded that there were no terms of repayment on this disbursement. We do not own an ownership stake in Mr. Nuncio's company to date, even though it's been 2 years since that disbursement. And when I asked where the money had gone or where it was housed, the chairman said, quote, "I'm assuming he spent it to live on," end quote, which is a shocking admission, since the nominal premise was that this was money intended for Mr. Nuncio's business endeavor and was somehow going to generate a return on investment to the tribe that the tribe would benefit from. 2 years later on, the tribe has nothing to really show for the chairman's disbursement of $50,000 from Indian City Screen Printing's general ledger to one tribe citizen. And it also raises questions of equity, of fairness, and of just general righteousness. As you mentioned before, it kind of dovetails, at least from my perspective, with the kind of situations with the raises where almost everyone in the tribe was getting a 3% adjustment for cost of living. But there were, as you mentioned, a select few positions where in the proposed budget draft for fiscal year 25 through 26, the chairman wanted to allocate raises of anywhere from 8 to 17% for folks like his executive assistant, for folks like the chief financial officer slash treasurer, for a select few folks who generally occupy kind of higher levels of employment within the tribe. And, as far as the legislature could see, there was not a really compelling rationale of why there was that inequitable application of monies for those raises. And then in the same way, I will dive into it kind of internally, but I'm going to be hard pressed probably to see where there's a rationale for a disbursement of $50,000 to one private individual, no strings attached. We don't have anything to show for it 2 years later. And, as we're all aware, we have folks struggling to make ends meet. So one of the kind of angles that I was trying to clarify with the chairman during the hearings was what determines who gets that kind of handout from the tribe. And I don't think we got a ton of clarity on that.
No, I agree with you. We were trying to figure out like who gets help. One of the bills that I sponsored was one of the sponsorship acts, and which was is money that was set aside and it was budgeted in the budget last year to the sum of $100,000 that
Right.
went to societies, Kiowa societies, cultural organizations, and Kiowa churches.
Right.
That money was supposed to be geared towards helping those organizations in the community out with whether it be for their ceremonies, their dances, or their church functions. And what I saw was an expenditure report that blew my mind, where we're sponsoring individual people for example, I'll use there was a citizen that we sponsored to do an Ironman competition
Right.
for the sum of $2,500.
Right.
How does that fit into one of those categories?
Yeah.
And the chairman answered that it doesn't. I wanted to help this individual citizen out, and I did. And so he gave him $2,500 to enter an Ironman competition. And there was another sponsorship. It wasn't that amount, but it was, I think, $250 that went towards to an individual citizen. Why are
Right.
we giving money from the sponsorship account that's supposed to be for Kiowa societies, cultural organizations, and churches, and we're sponsoring individual citizens for
Right.
competitions? That's not part of the law. So that is a violation of our law that the legislature passed. And so
Absolutely.
that was what something I think is related to. He wants, it appears that he wants us to support him on all these ventures, but not ask questions. Well, that's not transparency. Citizens need to know what our plans are for how we're using the Kiowa people's money. And we are asking those questions. We asked those questions prior to these hearings, that's what prompted these hearings, and this is what we're finding out. And everything that was going to be, was talked about. When we talked about the investigations that are going on through the Office of the Inspector General, the National Gaming Commission investigation, there was a lot that we had asked about, and the legislature's basically been stonewalled. Like
Yeah,
we are not provided information. Therefore, that's why we had subpoena all this information for these hearings, because the people need to know, what there's a lot of uh, concern, and people don't know about it. So we're kind of digging in, and now we've got a lot of things that we covered in those 3 days of hearings that we have to uh, figure out how we're going to utilize that information and what's our way forward. So is there anything you want to talk about what we found during the hearings? I mean, what I found during the hearings was a violation of our laws, i.e., the Sponsorship Act. No accountability for how money has been spent. For example, the sponsorship to Theodore Nuncio in the amount of $50,000. He was basically provided a loan to start up a business. There's no business, and on record, he said, I guess he spent this money to live off of.
yeah.
So there's no accountability for that money. I'd like to know, what is the plan for, uh, Indian City green printing? We had never been given anything like as a return, or, what the number was. It was over $500,000, but I think it was beyond that. Like the person was actually living at the facility in Anadarko, like in a I think it was an RV
V.
behind the facility, hooked up to the water and electricity. So in my mind, that's even more money that that we're paying this person, and only I think $10,000 ever came back to the tribe. So there's a lot of concern for where this money has gone, and nobody's being held accountable. So the legislature has to figure out how we hold somebody accountable for this mismanagement of our budget and not being able to share information.
Yeah. And I mean, I think to your point, and as the folks kind of on the call can probably glean from our back and forth, there's a lot of density and complexity to kind of what all of this entails and encompasses. It's not just about kind of the pure mismanagement or poor management of tribe monies. That's bad enough. But as you kind of allude to, there are pretty clear cut, just on the surface of things, violations of tribe statute, tribe law. There's what you mentioned, kind of the Sponsorship Act, where there were provisions therein were, at least I'm of the same thinking as you, those provisions were violated. We also had kind of just weird expenditures like from casino funds of, I believe, $25,000 to stand up the chairman's annual golf tournament. It only yields about $20,000 for donations to the Kiowa Education Foundation. There was also a $100,000 disbursement to Rainy Mountain Church. And I want to be clear that I think Rainy Mountain Church should be supported. It's obviously a historical jewel and kind of lodestar of our culture, but that does not authorize kind of circumvention of tribe law. There are ways kind of budgetarily and processes where the budgetary allocation process can be sort of worked with to provide aid and to provide support. And then, of course, there was a $75,000 expenditure, I believe, to the Indian relays in 2023. And so there's been at least from my
A
perspective,
pattern.
yeah, and I would characterize it as blowing through tribe money. I mean, when a lot of these kind of amounts of dollars can subsidize in whole or in part aid to our people. And then, of course, as we talked about, there have been clear-cut violations of the Economic Due Diligence Act of 2018 with respect to the component of Mr. Nuncio. I mean, I think that there's a lot of that $50,000 payout, no strings attached, to a tribe citizen is not defensible as an economic investment, and that sort of also raises questions that we are going to have to dive into internally and with legal counsel about kind of what the implications therein are, because $50,000, no repayment, no terms of repayment is not a loan, it's a gift. And I think we have to kind of, limn the nuances there and sort of um, dive into the nuances. But kind of looking forward, I know we're kind of hitting our last quarter of the hour, so I just want folks to know, and I'm sure this was kind of like on the agenda as well. You and I discussed that the plan herein is to develop a comprehensive post-mortem report effectively of kind of everything that we learned, all of the kind of main takeaways, and what the kind of intersections is of the facts that we've gathered to date with tribe law. And we're going to publish that as a legislature and make a recommendation of how to move forward procedurally, as a legislature, and make a recommendation so that people have transparency and in clear black and white text, kind of what has happened to date, what we learned in the hearings, and what the best path forward from the perspective of the legislature is. And I think, as we are kind of looking at right now, and as hopefully folks can glean from, as I mentioned before, we had, 3 days of testimony from Richard McMahon, from Chairman Spotted Bird, and from two executive branch officials. And that's a lot of kind of testimony to unpack, to cross-reference with documents. We also had document production consistent with the subpoena process. It's unfortunate that we had to actually subpoena a lot of the info in order to get clarity on the kind of variables in play. But I know you're in the process of this, and I am as well, of kind of reviewing recordings of the videos, transcripts, documents. We're going to compile a report with the full legislature. The other 5 legislators are going to be part of that process. And we will hopefully in the next upcoming weeks have that finalized for tribe citizens to read at their leisure. I'm sure we will publish that on our kiowatribe.org/legislative webpage. And just so folks are aware too, I know our intrepid legislative staff is currently in the process of uploading the footage from those hearings to an accessible kind of format that will be also on our legislative website. And, folks can sort of dive into the proceedings at their leisure through the audiovisual recording as well. None of that will be redacted. And so folks can sort of make their own determinations and get a picture and a full comprehensive scope of awareness of what exactly we're talking about in those reports, both in text, but also through referencing those videos and the footage. And they can sort of come to their own conclusions as well. But I think our angle and our sort of objective is to provide people and Kiowa citizens with the most robust and the most thorough inventory of facts possible to give them an idea of kind of, all of these questions and what has been at play, so they themselves are empowered with knowledge about the state of their tribe.
I think you are exactly right. I mean, that's been an issue for many, many years, is a due process. I mean, we asked for information, we weren't getting it. We subpoenaed the information, and the chairman had the opportunity to kind of present that information to the legislature to have our questions answered. And this was not a legal hearing; it's a fact-finding hearing. We are trying to get information to do our jobs. From here on out, once we publish that report, part of that report will be recommendations. What are we going to do moving forward to take action on what we have found out and discovered as fact from these hearings? So I think that'll be also be a part of that report. So I know we only got about 10 more minutes left. So let's answer a question that we had. One of the questions, Cole, if you want to respond first, was from one of the citizens. Is what do the legislatures think about legislation that would require the tribe to incorporate a permanent Kiowa government institute whereby the tribe would be responsible for teaching tribal members about what the Kiowa tribal government is responsible for, i.e., their duties and responsibilities, uh, could be their issues and relations, their history, how it functions, how and why Kiowa citizens should participate. How do we get young Kiowa members to know or understand or comprehend the purpose of the tribal government in relation to their identity? I know there's a lot in that one question, but uh,
Yeah, I mean,
you.
I can dive into that.
Mhm.
I think the germ of the question sort of gets at a fundamental element that is, really important, and the importance has asserted itself over the course of this kind of process because one of the chairman's kind of biggest sort of expressions of reaction or sort of a recurring leitmotif from the chairman is that the legislature is not supporting him, quote unquote. And I know anyone who's listened to the weekly address from the chairman kind of has heard that refrain from him. And, fundamentally, constitutionally, it's not the job of the legislature to support the chairman. I think that support and kind of collaboration are always healthy and helpful for tribal governments. But one of the, main elements that I always emphasize is that, whether it's the federal United States government or our tribal government here with this relatively new constitution, um, is that we operate by a system of checks and balances, and it is also collaboration is healthy, but questions from branches of government to the other are also healthy as well. Clarifying questions, that's how you work through, finding compromise. I know that Warren, you're like a very big proponent of identifying common ground, of compromise. And the way that we do that is we have back and forth collaborative dialogues where and part of dialogue though is it's not just rubber stamping what the executive branch wants without question. It's asking clarifying questions to help us understand the state of affairs so that we can discharge our unique duties as a legislature as well. And so I think that clarifying those components is definitely helpful because, collaboration is healthy, but a certain amount of, um, working through com conflicting perspectives is also healthy as well. It helps us refine kind of best legislation or best sort of paths forward for the tribe too. And so I think getting an idea of to all of our citizens of a kind of accurate understanding of the scope of our government is going to be imperative. I know legislator Elena Quitone, who was my predecessor as a District 4 legislator, is a big proponent and advocate for having some sort of constitutional convention. I think the format of something like that, like the question posed, I believe, kind of the idea of having a permanent sort of institute or something of that nature. And I know Legislator Quitone has previously talked about like a specific kind of contained convention or something of that nature. I think the variables about the specifics of the kind of form would have to be worked through, but I think the general idea is great and would also just have to be kind of a question of budgeting and allocating tribe resources to that. But I think ensuring kind of everyone has the best understanding possible of the roles and responsibilities as well as the KIC and the judiciary, in addition to the legislature and the executive branch, would be ideal. But the other kind of component I think that was asked was how can we ensure that our youth in the tribe have kind of an engagement with or a buy-in um, to the tribe government and its operations and its importance. And I know you, Warren, have Devin in your office and work to engage kind of young people. That's something as well that we're doing in District 4 as well. We have an intern named Noah Valenzuela, who is of the Satokan Big Bow families. So, making sure that we have kind of maybe a more robustly built out internship program or page kind of program consistent with state and federal legislatures might be kind of something we develop in the future. But that's obviously one way to ensure and effectuate kind of participation by the youth in our tribe.
Oh, I like the idea of a Kiowa Government Institute, something, some vehicle. We need some way, because I think what many of our citizens think legislators are is, they're the people I go to get help with social services or to get help with enrollment or and I think that needs to change because we as legislators are not a social service organization. We're supposed to, and according to our Constitution, our responsibilities are to write laws, resolutions, approve the budget, advocate, and assess the needs of our different districts. And I think that's what our primary roles are. And the execution part falls under the executive branch, i.e., execute, executive. He's supposed to be the one, or the executive branch is the one that's supposed to be reaching out to these citizens, making sure they have access to those resources. And unfortunately, a lot of times people are calling our offices and we tell them, District 7, I have over 5,000 citizens in District 7, and I can't, process applications for everybody, so I have to direct them where they should go. But I think a lot of our citizens think that, legislative offices are here to just access their services. And really, I want to talk to my citizens about laws that we need to incorporate into the tribe, to make our tribal government function better. But that takes a lot of time and effort. And yeah, we have some staff. I have Lisa here who was working with ARP. She's now my working for the tribe, but she helps people kind of connect with those services. But I think that needs to change, and so maybe an institute of that kind would kind of help educate people about what the different branches of government, like you mentioned, the KIC. What does the KIC branch do? Where does the judicial branch fit in? I think
Right.
our people need to be educated on what that means. So
Can I
let's move. Oh,
can I
go ahead.
just want to interject real quick point? I know we got to keep it moving, but just a point you raised, which is that the legislature is kind of constitutionally tasked with monitoring the government and creating laws. And so a really good example of that is the Emergency Response Fund Act legislation that was just passed by the legislature. So the legislature created the law, kind of appropriating the money and also mandating, I believe, a 48-hour turnaround time in the statute to get the checks out because we're kind of sensitive to the reality on the ground. And that's where, folks do come to our legislative offices for processing applications. So you and I are both aware of kind of the pervasiveness of need in the community and among the citizenship once kind of SNAP was suspended. And so, in collaboration with, or in dialogue, I guess is a better formulation, with the executive branch, we determined, okay, we can pull this money from local and tribal consistency funds. You and I developed that legislation. It was passed by the legislature. It was signed into law by the chairman. And once it's signed into law by the chairman, the executive branch has the prerogative to effect and implement and execute the provisions of the law. And I know that that's been a point of confusion for folks over the course of the past couple of weeks because there have been substantial delays in that money getting out. But it would be helpful as sort of like an institutional kind of didactic, I think, because you and I and the other legislators don't manage social services. We don't manage the executive branch departments. That is the prerogative and constitutional mandate of the chairman. And so getting clarity on some of those kind of components will probably be helpful for our citizenship at large, kind of, should a per cap, for example, ever get implemented, or so should questions about policy arise. So I'm just wanted to give that as a sort of case in miniature of what you're talking about, essentially. But I know we got to keep it moving as well. So, Warren, you're muted.
We've got one more question here. What is the process for revising the budget to lower those overpaid positions? So I'll respond first. The process is now, I mean, we are expecting to have a draft in December of a budget, and we can start to have those discussions with the executive branch. But they have to be open to the lowering those. Right now, there was a response when we questioned those raises. They came back and there was no changes made. They just kind of presented themselves, hey, y'all need to rubber stamp these. and we couldn't go along with that. And plus, the budget was handed to us. I think that next week it was due on that Saturday. We didn't get it till that Monday. There was a lot of things that we need to work on together. So having a dialogue, breaking down that line of communication is important. So we do have an opportunity to lower those overpaid positions at this juncture, in my mind. Cole,
Yeah.
you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so as Warren mentioned, the legislature has identified the sort of December regular session to get kind of adjustments budgetarily constructed in and passed as legislation. And what happens at that juncture is the chairman will have to sign any sort of legislation making adjustments to the budget in media res or kind of in the middle of the year. And if he vetoes it, then we'll have to override it unanimously. I believe 6 of 7 are required on the legislature to override a budget, and then it would go to the standard electoral process where it gets put on the ballot for the citizenship at large or eligible votership at large to cast their approval or disapproval on. So that process is going to begin in December, and depending upon kind of the chairman's willingness to sign it into law, that could potentially kind of prolong the process if he doesn't sign it into law, because we would then have to be kind of approaching it as an override. But at least from the legislative kind of perspective, we are going to be making adjustments to effectuate, equity in the next forthcoming weeks. And I know Warren already sort of got the ball rolling on this in, I think it might have been September, when we passed a 3% uniform COLA adjustment law. And Warren was the sponsor of that. And so that kind of, at least in statute, for future budgets, implements equitable sort of application of raises, where we're not going to, by statutory kind of mandate, we're not going to see these huge 20% jumps for some people and 3% for others. So that's already been sort of one moving puzzle part that has been kind of accomplished by Warren with the support of the legislature at large. And I believe the chairman vetoed that, and we actually had to override the veto, which I believe was kind of unanimous agreement among the legislators and supporting Warren's resolution in that angle.
All right. Well, thank you, Cole. I think we had some other questions. That was the one question that was submitted, but we're at time. Well, maybe we need to do another follow-up webinar at some point. It was scheduled from noon to 1 today. We may have you back in next month, December, when we get that budget, so we can have maybe a group session and a webinar on what that is included in that. So we just wanted to have a short conversation today on what we gleaned from the hearings. I think we've talked about, the process, what led up to those hearings, what we learned, and then we talked about what we're going to go for. So what we're going to do going forward is present that report to the citizens, and then, have a discussion on what we can do to take action and hopefully rectify some of the facts that we learned during those hearings.
Absolutely. Well, it was fun, so I'll join you again anytime.
I appreciate it, Cole. Thank you all for joining in on our webinar today. Again, we're going to do these monthly. We'll try to have the next one set in December. So monitor our Facebook. You can always go to our website, kiowatribe.org, under the legislatures page. District 7, we have our own page. We also have a YouTube channel where you can review the actual recording of this webinar. Will be posted to our YouTube channel. You can just YouTube it, Kiowa Tribe District 7. Also, we have it on, it'll be saved on I think we're going to have to post it on our website as well. So thank you all for joining today. We hope to have more of these discussions in the future. And thank you, Cole, again for being my guest.
Yeah,
and
thank you for having me.
We'll have you back in the future.
Sounds great.
All right, everybody have an outstanding day. Hej, moi, bon, all.